he looks at me from across the table and he says, "See you next Tuesday."
I'll show you more of that interview with E. Jean Carroll's lawyer in just a moment, but let me fill you in on the context. As you're all aware of, I'm sure, Trump recently lost big in his E. Jean Carroll defamation case, a ruling of $83.3 million in damages Trump's going to have to pay to E. Jean Carroll. And now that that's over, Carroll's lawyer, Roberta Kaplan, is free to explain some of her experiences with Donald Trump in the courtroom and then the subject of this story during their depositions when she was interviewing him for the case. And this interview took place specifically at Mar-a-Lago. And there are two elements that I want to break down. The first is the fact that Trump lost his mind because his lawyers helped E. Jean Carroll's team and the court staff to lunch when he didn't want them to. And the second is Trump calling Roberta Kaplan the C word using a childish code that people use, "See you next Tuesday." Former president, ladies and gentlemen. And this came out during an interview with Kaplan on George Conway's podcast. George Conway explains it all. And here's CNN reporting on this.
Roberta Kaplan, the lead attorney who helped clinch a whopping $83 million verdict for Trump accuser E. Jean Carroll, is spilling some serious tea on a podcast with George Conway, who introduced Kaplan, by the way, to E. Jean Carroll. Kaplan went into juicy detail about what it was like to depose the former president behind closed doors at Mar-a-Lago. Take a listen.
We have a court reporter, we have a videographer, they're entitled to a lunch break. You're here at Mar-a-Lago. What do you think you're going to do for lunch? Where are you going to get lunch? And so I said to him, well, you know, I raised this question with your attorneys yesterday, sir, and they graciously offered to provide us with lunch. At which point there was a huge pile of documents, exhibits sitting in front of him, and he took the pile and he just threw it across the table.
So because the day before, Trump's lawyers got lunch for E. Jean Carroll's team and all the people involved in this deposition, Trump threw papers off of a desk because he's a child. And it's truly stunning that this is the person who has cultivated the largest cult in American history. This is the guy. Here's more from the podcast.
Yeah, so let me get you there. So I'm still at the fraud deposition. We go through, we end about 4:00 in the afternoon, and we come in the room and I say, I'm done asking questions, and immediately I hear from the other side, off the record, off the record, off the record. So they must have planned it. And he looks at me from across the table and he says, "See you next Tuesday."
For the second deposition. Was the deposition on a Tuesday, counsel?
And no, I don't think it was. We'll look it up, but I don't think it was. And I, thank God, had no idea what that meant. So I said to him, "What are you talking about? I'm coming back on Wednesday." Which literally is an honest answer. I had no idea what he was talking about. Then we get into the car.
Did he respond? Wait, did he laugh?
But they
or
said,
something?
"See," they said it sort of like in a deliberate way, right? I mean,
yeah. You could tell it was like a kind of a joke again, like teenage boys would come up with.
Yeah,
but again,
that is a teenage boy level joke.
Yeah, I wasn't in on the joke, so I had no idea. Then we get into the car, and my colleagues are like, "Robbie, do you know what that means?" And I'm like, "No, what are you talking about?" They tell me, and I'm like, "Oh my God, thank God I didn't know, because had I known, I for sure would have gotten angry. There's no question I would have gotten angry, and I didn't because I didn't know. So I was super polite, and I looked like I was being above it all, which I wasn't. I just didn't understand." So then
that's just an amazing story.
So he uses a coded version of the C word. What? This is one of the things that baffles me about the situation we're in American politics. So, of course, in a really consequential sense, over here, you have the fact that Donald Trump could literally end American democracy. He tried to when he attempted to block the peaceful transfer of power, and he has even worse intentions for a second term. But then, because that's so massive, consequential, existential, sometimes I forget to emphasize that just personally, or emphasize it, but not enough, personally, as a guy, regardless of his status and influence, just as a person, he's extremely vile. We've obviously been talking about that with him being found liable for sexually abusing E. Jean Carroll, and that comes after he was accused by dozens of people of different forms of sexual misconduct, and that comes as we have a recording of him bragging about sexually assaulting women. Then you have story after story of stuff like this. And yet the people who say it's acceptable for them to be disgustingly judgmental towards people because of, for example, who they choose to love, because of these people's family values, they don't have a problem with throwing those family values in the garbage disposal for Donald Trump. Here was some of that same CNN segment after the panel watched those clips.
You go down the Google rabbit hole. This is about a female slur against a woman, which he had no problem saying in the room in front of her. Like, I just, in the case that he didn't need to be in, if he had just shut his mouth about a woman, these are the kinds of things that just, it self-owns for no reason. It may get him angry. I'm glad she didn't understand what that was, with the slur that was being said to her, so she didn't get angry. But like, it's more raw and more rude than we're giving it credit for.
Speaking of raw.
Yeah, I think we're so used to being unsurprised by everything Trump says and does because he's constantly being horrible. But we can't let ourselves do that. It is worse than a lot of people are giving it credit for, as she mentioned. And we have to make a point every time these stories come out of really emphasizing the vile nature of Donald Trump. Yes, in the threat he poses and the power he could attain and what he intends on doing with it, but also in the person that he is, even when the cameras aren't rolling. Now, going back to Trump throwing the papers off of the desk because his lawyers dared to get lunch for people he didn't like, that reminded me of what I want to show you next. It is well within Trump's previously reported on character to have those sorts of outbursts, except sometimes it's not just papers he's throwing. Trump's response, according to Cassidy Hutchinson, to seeing the reporting, and this is right after the 2020 election, that Trump's Attorney General Bill Barr had said there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud. Those claims aren't true. And this was Trump's response.
Ms. Hutchinson, how did the president react to hearing that news?
Around the time that I understand the AP article went live, I remember hearing noise coming from down the hallway, so I poked my head out of the office, and I saw the valet walking towards our office. He had said, "Get the chief down to the dining room, the president wants him." So Mark went down to the dining room and came back to the office a few minutes later. After Mark had returned, I left the office and went down to the dining room, and I noticed that the door was propped open and the valet was inside the dining room changing the tablecloth off of the dining room table. He motioned for me to come in and then pointed towards the front of the room near the fireplace mantle and the TV, where I first noticed there was ketchup dripping down the wall and there's a shattered porcelain plate on the floor. The valet had articulated that the president was extremely angry at the Attorney General's AP interview and had thrown his lunch against the wall, which was causing them to have to clean up. So I grabbed a towel and started wiping the ketchup off of the wall to help the valet out. And he said something to the effect of, "He's really ticked off about this. I would stay clear of him. He's really, really ticked off about this right now."
And Ms. Hutchinson, was this the only instance that you are aware of where the president threw dishes?
It's not.
And are there other instances in the dining room that you recall where he expressed his anger?
There were several times throughout my tenure with the Chief of Staff that I was aware of him either throwing dishes or flipping the tablecloth to let all the contents of the table go onto the floor and likely break or go everywhere.
So because Bill Barr wouldn't bolster Trump's lies on the election, Trump lost his mind and threw a plate at the wall, breaking it and leaving ketchup on the wall. Again, that's who the Republican Party wants to lead them. That's the guy who they want to have the nuclear codes, that very stable genius, as he called himself. Frightening. Make sure you are subscribed to the YouTube channel, and you can become a member at lukebeasleyshow.com/membership to get the daily bonus show.